The trick with Canadian federalism, as veteran NDP operative Brian Topp once said, is to find the thread that unites the pearls. This week we saw what may well prove to be the dawning of a new era of cooperative federalism, and Mark Carney and the premiers met to discuss driving forward nation-building projects, in his words. To discuss whether he's found the thread that unites those pearls, I'm joined by Dr. Heather Exner-Pirot, a senior fellow and director of Energy, Natural Resources and the Environment at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and a senior fellow and advisor for the Business Council of Canada. Heather, welcome.
Yeah, great to be here.
So, has Carney found that thread? Do you think that the ideas that were put forward, now we don't know the exact project list, but we kind of know the general direction. Do you think that will increase national prosperity going down the avenue we seem to be going down? Or do you think that we may be pursuing white elephant projects that either are unfeasible or technically and bureaucratically, or they are just not economic?
Yeah, a little from column A and a little from column B, John. So there is, the tone is markedly improved from the last Liberal government. So there is some optimism. There is a sense that the federal government will be a partner in building things, whether, for a long time we've thought they were blocking our ability to build things. So all a great start, and Hodgson has said, all the right things so far. Now, of course, there's so long that you can have a honeymoon period before things have to happen. We actually have to see some action. And we know that Liberal governments are very good at rhetoric and not so great at implementation. So now, the direction it's going is a little concerning in that, so far they want to, have a short list of nation building projects that they determine if it's nation building and use the public purse, I assume, for most of them to fund them in cases where the private sector would not have stepped up. And there may be a handful of projects where you feel that's justified. There's obviously a role for governments to build infrastructure, but the low-hanging fruit is obviously to improve our regulatory competitiveness. We have very restrictive, very burdensome regulatory processes. There's a lot of projects that proponents want to do on their own without government help if the regulation was better, if we had higher tax competitiveness, better tax competitiveness with our competitors. And so, I will tolerate a handful of these nation-building projects, I think, if they make sense from a business side. But at the end of the day, within, I would say, 6 months or a year, we're going to need to see the regulations improved and streamlined.
So, two things on that, on regulatory approval and on tax. Mark Carney's talked about a 2-year regulatory window. And we're currently at 5 times that? So we're around 10 years, 8 to 10 years. That seems very ambitious. First of all, is that doable? Secondly, the tax competitiveness. Are you suggesting that we either abolish or freeze the industrial carbon tax?
Yeah, okay, 2 different questions here, so let's dig in. On the first one on regulation, it's, depending on what you're building will take more or less time. Depending on if you need a federal approval and a provincial approval will take more or less time, the complexity, and whether there's Indigenous support. So ideally, yes, I think 2 years is a great target. We should walk before we run. I guess, for some of these things, 3 years would also look pretty good. But 2 years is certainly feasible if we had good processes and if we had good relations with the Indigenous partners. The concerns were talking about 6 months, and that just didn't seem feasible to me, that you would never be able to fulfill your duty to consult and accommodate in such a timeline. So 2 years is ambitious but doable, and we should reach for it. On your other question, which is the industrial carbon tax. Some of it is just, the capital gains, that was a whole brouhaha. And we all know there is a level at which the more you tax, the less investment you come in, and actually the less tax take you get. And UK is finding out this economic lesson right now in real time. And so, again, a lot of Canadian capital, if you're talking about energy and resource sector, those are goods that you can invest in any mine or in any project. And it has absolutely been the case that Texas in particular, southern United States, has been just an easier jurisdiction, better regulation, better tax, and that our capital has gone south. And so we would like to bring some of that capital back home. But at the end of the day, investors are going to make those decisions based on the return that they get. So yes, if we build those projects here, we get the royalties, we get the taxes, we get the jobs. So let's make sure that our tax system is competitive so that capital actually wants to choose Canada.
You mentioned the Indigenous component, and 15 years ago, I remember just about every project was ending up in court and it's essentially not getting built. Has that landscape changed? I mean, this government has been very vocal about raising the amount that First Nations can borrow as loan guarantees. Everybody's talking about equity partnerships. Does that change the picture fundamentally, do you think?
Yeah, and I just, just to take it back a step, in the 20th century, I would say there was very little attention paid to Indigenous rights and Indigenous concerns, and they were railroaded, and they didn't get really benefits from projects in their territory. When this really changed was when the Supreme Court affirmed the duty to consult and accommodate in a series of decisions in just 2004 and 2005. And that's when the landscape shifted, where an impact and benefit agreement went from a nice to do, corporate social responsibility, to a need to do. And Indigenous state rights holders started to really leverage the fact that, they could block a project, they could delay it if they weren't satisfied, with the outcome. And that has been a real struggle, and it's been painful and it's been expensive. But over the last 20 years, industry and Indigenous stakeholders, rights holders have come to some, have found some models that actually work. And a loan guarantee is probably the best example. And we've seen it work exceptionally well in Alberta. It really helps with utility kinds of projects, pipelines, transmission, and power generation, where it's pretty low risk. You get, usually have a long-term contract, so that helps pay off the loan. It's no one's going to default. It's not as useful for things like upstream oil and gas production or mining development. And so we need a suite of tools, not just the loan guarantee. But for sure, for the kinds of things I think Carney is talking about, energy corridors, transmission, railroads, pipelines, that loan guarantee model is very good. It has been very successful. There's very low risk to the taxpayer, and it does help advance that reconciliation.
So we've been talking pretty generically till now, but let's get specific. Take a look at the map of Canada moving from east to west, and look at potential projects that could be put forward for this list. Do you think a bitumen pipeline should be a priority? And if so, which one?
Well, a bitumen pipeline to the West Coast should be a priority. So I'm sorry, John, we have to start west, not east.
Did I say west to east? I hope that's what I meant to say. I meant to say west to east.
Yeah. This is true fact. And Danielle Smith has said it, but my analysis suggests it's absolutely true. There is nothing that will change the economic growth, the GDP, the productivity per capita in this country as much as a bitumen pipeline. And so we have some egress. We have most of it. Everyone knows now that goes to the south. We finally added Trans Mountain about a year ago. That's at 90% utilization right now in 1 year. And people
can I just point out, because not 40%, which is what Stephen Guilbeault said.
It's not 70. I heard that one too. It's at 90. That's in the Golden Mail straight from Trans Mountain in their financial statements to the government last week. So that's a very high quality source. So in one sense, it's amazing. Our producers filled it so fast. There's clearly demand. We're seeing most of that demand's come from Asia, the majority, which we didn't know if it would come from California or Asia. So strong demand in global markets for Canadian heavy oil, but also concerning that, we added this pipeline and we're already, staring down at the barrel of running out of egress. And so there is urgency, I would say, from the producers that we need to start thinking about the next pipeline. And we know it's not, I don't think we're going to get Northern Gateway in 2 years. If everything went well, probably 4 years. And that's why we have to start saying it now and planning for it now. We can also expand Trans Mountain with, a few improvements. And if we can actually add a couple 100,000 barrels to Trans Mountain, that'll give us some breathing room. And if we want to send more south, we can also, again, expand some of those existing pipelines where you don't have to build a whole new pipeline and get a couple 100,000 barrels. But we're still looking at, I would say, 2027. We better know, we better have starting to, plan that next big pipeline.
I spoke to Ian Anderson, who was the head of TMX during the build, and he mentioned this northern leg, which is a part of the original plan. It was then shelved in 2005 or 6, but is still feasible, and he said you could build it in 2 or 3 years if you had First Nations support. It would go to Kitimat, so it would basically be a branch off the main TMX, I guess. Is that something that people are talking about?
I mean, if you went to Calgary and said, we'll build this pipeline, no one's going to say no to any pipeline. But if I were just to choose, I would say, and again, I think Ian has said that would add maybe 300,000 or 400,000 barrels. Yeah. And it would, ideal, then, which would be great. Ideally, we're going to add, let's have 1 million barrel pipeline to the West Coast. And so I certainly wouldn't be opposed to that. I think there's only so much political capital and financial capital to build pipelines in this country. So I would, if I had my way, I would have a bigger pipeline. And whether it goes to Kitimat or Prince Rupert's a little bit further. The politics may be a little bit easier. Kitimat is the home for a lot of the big LNG projects. So that'll be a busy place. So we'll see it ends up. But there's plan A, plan B, plan C, plan D. The first thing you had to do is get rid of the oil tanker ban. Others will have plan zero.
Well, you bring that up. So BC's objection to the tanker ban remains, according to David Eby. But none of these premiers exist in a vacuum. And the opinion polling, there was an Angus Reid poll which suggested the majority of Canadians are in favour of a pipeline to the West Coast, or reviving Northern Gateway, in fact. The majority of British Columbians are too. So presumably, if the federal government and all the other provincial governments and the people of British Columbia are on side, Mr. Eby would have to think again, no?
I'm finding this hard to understand because BC has actually done some constructive and progressive things on the economic development side since January, since Trump was inaugurated. And Eby has almost been the most, vocal, the maddest, a little bit, and wanting, the elbows up. And he stood there in February and said, if we don't sell Canadian oil and gas, they will just get it from places like Venezuela. And I thought, wow, this guy has, he's had the light bulb moment. He knows what's up. And now to hear this 2.5 months later is actually, frankly, quite disappointing. Now, a lot of this is federal jurisdiction, actually, so we want the feds to get out of the way, but not in interprovincial pipelines, because that is clearly federal jurisdiction. And we know from Trans Mountain, when BC, if you recall, BC said we will use every tool in the toolbox to stop this project. And they did, but it still wasn't their right. And so we do know from a lot of court precedents, yes, the feds can say yes to a pipeline, but yes, the feds can overturn the oil tanker ban. That's their jurisdiction. But what proponent really wants to step into a situation where, again, a provincial government is going to use every tool in the toolbox to stop your project? And so it's obviously not bullish for investment to have this, kind of political disagreement on the ground, which is extremely frustrating. It is our most prized resource, our most valuable resource. There's only one economic, reasonable way to get it to Tidewater. That's to BC, and BC is the bottleneck.
Still on the pipeline, in the meeting of premiers and Mark Carney last week, Alberta Premier Danielle Smith and Carney both talked about this grand bargain where, in inverted commas, decarbonised bitumen would be shipped to the West Coast. And the theory, as explained by Danielle Smith, was it would be decarbonised by carbon capture and storage, the Pathways Alliance project, which presumably the federal government would fund. Is this grand bargain feasible, do you think?
It is feasible. And I have an article coming out next week on this, so I have all the facts at hand, John. But, the emissions cap is just a preposterously expensive way to reduce emissions. At a minimum, it's about $2,000 a ton per carbon. And it's all in the paper next week, so you can see it. But the things that the industry itself has proposed is carbon capture and also using some solvents to reduce emissions. They've done since, in the last 11 years, have actually reduced carbon intensity emissions per barrel by 30%. And on an absolute basis have reduced it, I think, by 25 kilograms a barrel. So they are doing the work. A lot of the carbons comes from natural gas input to heat the bitumen. That's an expense. There's every reason why they would rather, not have to pay that kind of money and find ways. But right now, the oil sands on a life cycle basis is only about 1 to 3% higher emissions than the global average barrel, the average crude. And if you compared it to other heavies, they'd actually be, less than the average heavy. But if we did this carbon capture, if we did some of the solvent innovations that they're using, they would actually be below the global average on a life cycle basis. And so there is a grand bargain to be had. Industry itself has been advocating it, and I've heard it in closed doors. It's not just propaganda, it's not marketing. I've heard it behind closed doors, them saying we want this. We're very competitive on an economic basis. We want to be competitive on a carbon basis. So there's great work to be done. I think there's a grand bargain. What Danielle Smith is saying is, if you have no point of view on increasing your production, where is the money going to come to spend probably $20 billion on these technologies? If you know you're going to get another pipeline and you can increase your production and fill it 1 million barrels a day, well, now there's more revenue coming in, and there's a justification. But if you have to spend billions of dollars and you can't increase production, the math does not math. These are publicly traded companies. They get investment just like everyone else. That investment can go to NVIDIA, it can go to Meta, it can go to Volkswagen, it can go to any other company. And so they have to have that return. And if all your profits have to be driven into carbon capture, you're just not going to get any investment.
So what's the stumbling block? Just the amount of federal dollars that are going to be put in?
Yes. And so I think that's where the negotiations are trying to figure out, how much does industry pay, how much does the province pay, how much do the feds pay. And from industry's perspective, I think they want to be, good players, responsible players. But all of this is cost. None of this is profit. And again, like I say, they still have to have a certain level of return from the investors, or the investors will just take off and you won't have any money to put into carbon capture. The money has to come from somewhere. Right. And so figure out what is that magic, formula of dividing where the Canadian oil sands sector can be competitive. Meanwhile, by the way, paying royalties, paying taxes, having the best paying jobs in the country, increasing our exports that supports our dollar. So there's a lot of benefit to having them grow and being competitive. And so, who should pay? Is it a public good? Is it a private good? All that kind of thing.
Moving east, you've been particularly skeptical about Arctic ports being commercially viable. You noted that the feds in the province have spent more than $500 million on the port of Churchill, and it's still not attracting shippers or investment. In the Northwest Territories, they're trying to make up for a diamond mine industry that's nearing the end of its lifespan. It's proposing this Arctic Security Corridor, which is a road from, I guess the road from Alberta to Yellowknife exists, but then Yellowknife to the Arctic Ocean, terminating at Grays Bay in Nunavut. The problem with both of these is that the shipping season is pretty short. Global warming has, I guess, increased it marginally, but not significantly, and has also shortened the seasons for ice roads. So is all this just a pipe dream on the part of premiers who are looking for economic activity? Yeah,
so I hate to be in this position because I'm, if I would describe myself, like I Indigenous and northern and rural development is the thing I care about the most. Now I'm in this position to say why northern development is a bad idea. It's a terrible idea for oil, terrible idea. And it's a very bad idea for liquefied natural gas. For the reasons you mentioned, is we're talking about in a perfect world, 4-month shipping season. You will never get a return on your investment to build that pipeline east to a seasonal port where there's much more environmental complexity. When again, you can just go west. It's shorter, it's easier, it's faster. You're going to the Asian market, which is the world's biggest energy market, fastest growing. Now, but we do want northern development. We do want those regions to prosper at a local level. I don't think that this is going to turn in, this is not the thing that's going to grow our GDP. This is not the thing that's going to help Canada diversify its exports away. But a port in Churchill and a port in Grays Bay can be useful for helping local mining development happen. And that's important for jobs, for taxes, for royalties, for those communities' economic health. The Port of Churchill you also need just for resupply. So there's a reason it's public good to provide some basic infrastructure, basic transportation access for the people that live there. And critical minerals is a very different thing from oil, where you can mine, and we see this with private-led sectors in Mary River, in Nunavut, with Raglan Nickel Mine in northern Quebec, with Voisey's Bay in Labrador. You can mine, you can produce all year and stockpile it, and then in that short shipping season, you can ship it out. And it's not very expensive just to have it sitting there while the shipping season is closed. So energy corridor, that makes no sense. Even when they say port to port, like there's nothing you're shipping from Burnaby to Churchill, nothing. But anyways, yeah, I think from a northern development perspective, but not an export diversification perspective.
Moving east again to Ontario, Doug Ford's priority is the Ring of Fire. That was a gleam in a premier's eye when I was at Queen's Park, and that was more than 20 years ago. It doesn't seem to have progressed much since then. And if I remember rightly, it was a low commodity price at the time that really stymied development. You think prices are at a sufficient level to justify the investment now?
So there's so many things to unpack with Ring of Fire. And in one way, I hate, like, it's a worst case scenario. Not every mining project, not every development is like that in Canada. And not everyone has, the adversarial nature with local Indigenous nations, with the provincial government. It doesn't have to be that way. It's unfortunate with Ring of Fire. The real impetus, I think, for Ring of Fire was that, we were so focused on the EV supply chain and that supply chain security, that why, if you're going to build the EVs and that's your future for your auto manufacturing, don't be importing that stuff from China when you have it in your own backyard. So it was, I think, really about having that total independence for that supply chain for EVs. And whether the commodity price is justifying that is of course a different question. Right now, Ring of Fire is a road project. It's what we're trying to get built as a road, and that would unleash, some mining later. But I have to say this, for the mining sector, this is an inherently cyclical commodity. All of these are cyclical, and the timing matters a great deal. And that, yes, the prices may not be there today, but they need to be able to strike when the iron is hot. And so, to have the regulations in place, to see a line of sight, to be able to attract investors, so that when the price starts to go up to a certain point, you say, ours is the next best project. Ours is the one that should get built. So let's help those guys be prepared for when the commodity price is ready.
The other thing that Doug Ford mentioned was nuclear, and in Ontario Power Generation has now put a price tag on its small nuclear reactors. Is this the future for nuclear, or is it for power generation, or is this still such early stage that we don't really know how it's going to go?
This is the one area where I'll just go full socialist, where I just think, yes, this is a nation building project. We should lead on SMRs. And there's so many strategic reasons for Canada to do it. One is that we have the uranium source. We're the world's number 2 exporter, number 2 producer of uranium. We have just phenomenal deposit in northern Saskatchewan. There's a twin basin in Nunavut, for 100 years from now when we start to run out of that. And so, we could dominate the supply chain and the technology, and energy is big business. And we are building the first, as Stephen Lecce will say, the first G7 and the first SMR in the G7. It has taken some public money to get there. But there is a line of sight where being the first mover really does accord you some benefits as you try to sell these models in the future. There will only be so much room for so many models. And so getting in at the ground floor is very helpful. And so it does take money, but I do think it's the future. It's like, I'm not a huge, go ahead and do wind and solar, but there's a limited use case. There's only so much wind and solar that you can do. Even in hydro in Canada, we have tremendous hydro. We've neared the end of really big mega projects for hydro that are economically competitive. And we've seen the last few where boondoggles in their own right, in Manitoba and BC and in Newfoundland. And so where can we go next? Nuclear really has the potential, if you get the cost curve down. SMRs, the whole purpose of an SMR is to get the cost curve down, to start doing this in a modular fashion, in a factory fashion. And again, it's baseload clean energy that has actually very little land and very little material inputs. And so in 100 years, do I think we'll be doing mostly nuclear? Yes, I honestly do. And the potential for the North with microreactors is so phenomenal also.
Just to finish off, moving east again into the Maritimes, you mentioned wind power. Nova Scotia's big project is West Wind, which is a wind energy cable linked going west, I guess. So how feasible is that? And Energy East, is that dead?
So on wind, again, its wind is not looking good globally right now. It has not been attracting investment. It has been very expensive in the UK. And so, show me the math. But if it's just a project that just requires federal funding, then I would say, we should look at other projects. And then if we get to green hydrogen and the idea of shipping green ammonia across Europe at a competitive rate, I just don't see it. And I think we spent a lot of money already, and hardly any private sector money has been attracted in. And these, this isn't I don't think this is the future for Atlantic Canada. I don't think it'll make it a prosperous region. But of course, they have tremendous oil and gas reserves. And I have to say it, and actually the, Eastern Energy Conference is happening in St. John's right now. And so if we do want to which brings it back to Energy East. Very expensive and very difficult to build a pipeline from Alberta all the way to the east. When you have oil and gas out there already. And so, we do want Atlantic Canada to succeed, to prosper. There's nothing like oil and gas revenues that helps a provincial government's, budget. And so I would say let's focus on developing Atlantic Canada's oil and gas if we want to provide our allies in Europe with energy security, if we want to have more of our own energy security, get off Saudi American imports, for example, to the St. John refinery. So let's develop what we have all across the country. Let's serve Asian markets. Let's serve European markets. But we don't need to just have a small pie of Alberta oil going across the whole country.
I mean, Newfoundland put out some good news on its Jeanne d'Arc natural gas reserves, right? Its basin.
Yes, and that was, I guess the big announcement coming out of this conference, so that, you do have to do the work, and the government has been supporting it, the provincial government, and I support that, of doing some feasibility, so you can kind of direct, proponents of where to go, what's looking good, what is the size of the potential product. And that's gas, even more competitive on oil. And it is a nice light oil. It is closer to what we refine. It is closer to what Norway produces. And Norway oil and gas production, its offshore, is probably peaking this year. And so they will need some replacement for Norwegian kind of quality of crudes. And I think that can come from Newfoundland, which is why Equinor, the Norwegian-owned oil and gas company, is investing in Newfoundland, was there in St. John's. And the big project that they have their eyes on for the next project is Bay du Nord, and that would be an oil project.
Right. Just to wrap all of this up, I mean, at the end of the day, 85% of Canadians voted for parties that are advocating resource corridors and speedy development of nation-building projects. The premiers know this, which is presumably why they've all become holding hands and singing Kumbaya. Do you think this is a good, it's clearly a good omen, but do you think it's decisive enough moment that we could actually break through the log jams and actually get things done this time?
God help us if we don't. If we return to our complacency after what we've seen and what we've gone through, that God help this country. But the conversation right now, again, is focusing on a few projects. And even, governments offer us your projects, and then governments will decide which projects. And I'll be tolerant of this, like I say, maybe for a handful of projects and for a handful of months. But if we don't improve our regulatory systems, and we all no one's being coy about what the problems are with our regulatory systems, especially at the federal level. We know what we want to see. That is where we need to see movement. That is where the rubber will hit the road. And so, I hope we just can't keep going down this path, though, John. You can't just not build things. You can't bring in new people at the rate we bring in new people. And you can't be dependent on China at the rate that we're dependent on China, at the rate the United States is dependent on China. That cannot keep going on. And we could do it in a good way now, or we can do it in a very hard way later, I think.
Well, listen, thank you very much for your time and your expertise. Be well.
Thanks, John.